place! There we are!
Give me your hands. There we go.
Right, listen to my mate.
Murtaza Nazir was 26 years old, a new father and a much-loved husband. But in the space of just 30 seconds, his life was snatched away in a hail of bullets, gunned down outside his car in the Birmingham suburb of Stekford. To the public, it seemed like another tragic act of violence. But beneath the surface, this was the endgame of a highly coordinated gang operation, one that police would later describe as a professionally planned and ruthless assassination. It took 2 years to jail the first suspects, Tahir Zaman and Shamrez Khan, both handed life sentences in 2021. But the detectives weren't done. They knew others were involved, hidden in shadows, using cloned plates, encrypted comms, and tinted windscreens to mask their movements. It would take one of West Midlands Police's most extensive CCTV trawls in history to expose a third man, Akeem Lawrence, the silent orchestrator who thought he'd gotten away. This is the story of how a young dad was hunted and executed, how a gang built an operation designed to leave no trace, and how a few crucial mistakes allowed detectives to piece it all together and bring the killers to justice. To understand how Murtaza Nazir came to be gunned down outside his car in Stekford, Birmingham, we have to go back to the violent upbringings and criminal track records of the men who planned his death. Tahir Zaman and Shamrez Khan weren't unknown to police. By the time of the murder, both had already amassed serious convictions. Khan, at just 15, had once fired an air pistol into 2 teenagers' faces after being challenged for harassing a girl. Zaman had stabbed a man in the neck at 19. These weren't one-off outbursts. These were patterns of violence. They operated in an underworld shaped by paranoia, loyalty, and revenge. While Murtaza Nazir had no significant criminal footprint, it's believed he became entangled, either by proximity, association, or mistaken allegiance. The group that plotted his killing didn't act impulsively. They weren't petty dealers or reckless gangsters. This was a calculated move by men who had experience, resources, and a clear target. The motive hasn't been made fully public. But what is known is this. On the 28th of August 2020, the group decided Nazir's time was up. That morning, they began assembling their team. They moved between garages, picked up cars, changed clothes, and quietly began tracking their target's movements. Police would later uncover that at least 4 different vehicles were used across the day, with some swapped out just hours before the shooting. One of the early surveillance cars was directly linked to Shamrez Khan, who, crucially, had kept his mobile phone with him, an early but critical mistake. The network wasn't just shooters and drivers. There were people assigned to collect weapons, dispose of evidence, and shuttle the men from location to location. Nazir's death wasn't inevitable. It was chosen, and it was scheduled with precision. The vehicles used were selected not for speed, but for blend. Number plates were cloned, matching legitimate cars down to the color and model. Windows were blacked out to avoid CCTV detection. Their communications were conducted over walkie-talkies rather than traceable phones. What started as a low-visibility gathering of known names became a full-day operation. The men moved from garages to side roads to back seats, inching closer to their target. And by the time Nazir parked his car on Bagshaw Road, the kill team was already en route. The team behind Murtaza Nazir's murder was a structured operation with clear lines of responsibility, a mobile strategy, and careful timing. At its core were Shamrez Khan, Tahir Zaman, and Akeem Lawrence, but surrounding them was a wider web of collaborators who supplied logistics, transport, weapons, and cleanup. Akeem Lawrence, who would only be convicted 4 years later, wasn't the man pulling the trigger, but his role was arguably more central. He helped coordinate the sequence of events and ensured the right people were in the right places. Lawrence was also tied to vehicles and communication planning. His ability to remain undetected for so long highlights how well the group masked their hierarchy. On the day of the murder, at least 5 cars were involved. 2 of them, the Seat Leon and Dacia Duster, were used for the hit itself. These had only come into play in the final 90 minutes before the shooting, having replaced earlier reconnaissance vehicles. 2 men, masked and dressed in dark clothing, exited the back seats with handguns drawn. Their drivers kept the engines running, ready to bolt. The 5th vehicle, not present at the scene, was standing by to collect them once the job was done. Each car had a specific function. The early reconnaissance vehicles were used to track Nazir's movements and ensure he was home. Later, the cloned plate cars with blacked-out windows took over, their job to conceal identities and commit the actual murder. Once the shots were fired, the shooters were ferried to a safe location, their weapons handed off, the cars abandoned and burned or hidden. Communication was key. The gang used walkie-talkies throughout the day, deliberately avoiding phones, which could be tracked or intercepted. Mobile devices were either switched off or left behind altogether. The group had clearly studied how other gangs had been caught and built their system to avoid those pitfalls. Even still, cracks showed. Khan kept his phone on during part of the day. Zaman briefly pulled down his face covering to smoke a cigarette, exposing his identity to CCTV. Lawrence, for all his care, was later tied to key vehicle movements through exhaustive analysis. It was a network built for silence, but one that couldn't account for every human mistake. For Zaman, Khan and Lawrence, this was more than a hit. It was a demonstration. The murder of Murtaza Nazir wasn't just about silencing a perceived threat. It was about sending a message, staking dominance over rivals, and showing absolute control over their operation. Every element, from the cloned cars to the walkie-talkies, was about control. Over time. Over risk. Over fear. By the afternoon of August 28, 2020, they were deep into a sequence that had been prepared with almost military precision. Khan had already been spotted at a local garage where 2 of the murder vehicles were being stored. He wore the same clothing hours later, captured again by CCTV as he returned to the site just minutes after the shooting. Zaman, too, was caught on camera, but only because he couldn't resist a cigarette. Pulling down his mask exposed part of his face. Despite their errors, the group had built layers of separation between themselves and the shooting. The 2 masked gunmen who stepped out of the Dacia and Seat have never been formally identified. That wasn't accidental. They wore identical clothing, dark hoodies, gloves and face coverings, designed to obscure any identifying features. They jumped out, fired 10 rounds, and were gone in seconds. Nazir was hit 3 times in the back. The gang's movements were calculated down to the minute. Vehicles were only in place for a matter of seconds. The murder cars had their engines running throughout, minimizing response time. CCTV footage revealed the entire attack lasted just half a minute. Enough to take a life, but too short to allow witnesses a good look. But control extended beyond the scene itself. Weapons were never recovered. The murder cars vanished. The shooters melted into the city. Afterwards, the wider network moved into cleanup mode, disposing of evidence, offering alibis, securing new vehicles. Nazir's widow would later tell the court that she was forced to move homes repeatedly, unable to live one street away from where her husband died. The impact on her life, and that of their baby son, was brutal and permanent. Meanwhile, the killers had wanted the city to know they could strike fast, leave no trace, and walk away untouched. Or so they thought. For months the investigation seemed to stall. No murder weapon, no forensic evidence from the vehicles, and no eyewitnesses who could identify the masked shooters. It looked like the killers had pulled off the perfect crime, but it was a single truth that saved this case. There is no such thing. The breakthrough didn't come from a confession or a lucky find. It came from relentless, methodical work. Specifically, one of the largest CCTV operations in West Midlands police history. Hundreds of hours of footage were reviewed by Detective Jenkins, a specialist who tracked vehicle reflections in shop windows, doorbell cameras, and petrol station forecourts. He pieced together the convoy's movements frame by frame, mapping the switch between reconnaissance cars and the murder vehicles and tracking their journey across the city. The errors began to surface. Shamrez Khan had taken part in the early recon in a car that was clearly linked to him, and he kept his phone with him. That device placed him in key locations throughout the day. Later, he returned to the same garage minutes after the murder, wearing the same clothes caught again on CCTV. Zaman's cigarette break was worse. Not only did he lower his mask in front of a camera, he also dropped a butt with his DNA on it. Still, it wasn't enough for police to charge the third man, Akeem Lawrence. He had kept his head down, stayed behind the scenes, and distanced himself from the trigger pullers. But when investigators tied him to multiple vehicle transfers and linked encrypted phone records to the planning stage, his involvement was undeniable. There was also the issue of the clone plates. The vehicles used in the shooting were traced back to their points of acquisition. Two cars that had legitimate legal counterparts on the road. Investigators traced the Dacia and seat to their last known movements and matched them with Lawrence's contacts. Slowly a timeline emerged. Vehicles tracked, phones placed, outfits matched, reflections identified. It wasn't one glaring mistake. It was dozens of small ones pulled together by an obsessive investigative team who refused to let Nazir's killers walk free. For the killers, it had all been about control, but the cracks were there. And this time, the police were ready to prise them open. By late 2020, detectives had mapped out the key events leading to Murtaza Nazir's murder. What remained was turning the mosaic of movements and data points into something a jury could convict on. The focus shifted to building a watertight case, one suspect at a time. Shamrez Khan and Tahir Zaman were arrested first. Police had amassed overwhelming CCTV evidence, mobile phone tracking, and forensic matches. Khan's return to the garage after the murder placed him at the epicenter of the operation. Zaman's DNA was on the cigarette butt outside. Both were arrested, charged, and brought to trial in early 2021. The jury took little time to convict them of murder. Each received a life sentence with a minimum of 25 years. But investigators knew there was still a third man. Akeem Lawrence had been more cautious, avoiding the crime scene, steering clear of CCTV where possible. He didn't touch weapons. He didn't drive the murder cars. His role was higher up the chain. Detectives had to build a more complex case, one rooted in coordination, not contact. The breakthrough came from the combined analysis of mobile phone data, vehicle tracking, and witness statements. Lawrence had been in contact with both Khan and Zaman in the days prior. He had also been present at locations where the murder vehicles were seen and helped facilitate their movement. Police believed Lawrence oversaw key logistics, vehicle exchanges, route planning, and communication control. Further analysis of encrypted messages and vehicle sightings placed him in a commanding role. The Crown Prosecution Service agreed there was enough to charge. Lawrence was arrested and charged with murder and conspiracy to possess a firearm. He denied both. At trial in 2024, the prosecution laid out the full scale of the planning. 5 cars, at least 10 individuals involved, encrypted comms, walkie-talkies, and rapid post-crime disposal tactics. The judge described it as one of the most efficiently executed street assassinations Birmingham had seen. But he also noted, it wasn't flawless. And it was those flaws, slight, human, avoidable, that had allowed police to bring all 3 men to justice. After 4 years of investigation, dozens of officers, and thousands of hours of footage reviewed, the conspiracy was broken. The takedown was complete. In April 2021, Shamrez Khan and Tahir Zaman stood trial at Birmingham Crown Court. The evidence was overwhelming. CCTV, DNA, and phone data all painted a damning picture. The jury returned guilty verdicts on both for the murder of Murtaza Nazir. They were each sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years. The judge made it clear, both men were dangerous, calculating, and had histories of violent offending. For Khan, the judge recalled a chilling incident from when he was just 15, when he shot 2 teenagers in the face with an air pistol. Zaman's record included stabbing a man in the neck at the age of 19. 3 years later, in August 2024, Akeem Lawrence faced his own reckoning. Though he hadn't fired a shot, the court was convinced of his central role in planning the execution. He was found guilty of murder and conspiracy to possess a firearm. He too was handed a life sentence, his minimum term set at 35 years. The court considered Lawrence's involvement as even more integral, describing him as the architect of the hit. Mr. Justice Pepperell called the killing a professionally planned and ruthless assassination. In court, Nazir's widow read a victim impact statement. She described her husband as a kind, loving man who had been thrilled to become a father. Since the murder, she and their son had been uprooted from their home, surviving on benefits and moving from one temporary address to another. Her grief was raw, and her life shattered. Despite the convictions, the court acknowledged that some key figures had never been identified. The shooters themselves, the men who pulled the triggers, remain at large. Their faces, hidden behind masks, were never captured. Their identities are still unknown. Murtaza Nazir's murder exposed not only the chilling efficiency of gangland executions in the UK, but also the painstaking work required to unravel them. What began as a 30-second hit in a quiet Birmingham street became a 4-year saga of digital forensics, surveillance reconstruction, and investigative obsession. It reminds us that in today's gang landscape, violence is often the end product of days, even weeks, of planning. But it also proves something more vital, that justice, though slow, is possible. Even the most calculated criminals leave traces, and when the system works, silence can be broken and killers held to account.